Welcome to Watching the Tudors. I'm Heather.
And I'm Jonathan.
And this is the podcast where we rewatch the Tudors after almost 10 years. We go into the depth of history and background of the show, explaining the stories behind the story. You can learn more about us and the show at watchingthetudors.com. So let me talk about the reason why we're doing this and our Tudor cred. I'm Heather, and I started the Renaissance English History podcast in 2009, 2 years after the Tudors premiered. It was also the 500th anniversary of Henry VIII becoming king. It's still running, and if you want to get into even more depth on all things related to Renaissance England, check it out at englandcast.com. I thought it would be fun to go through and start rewatching the Tudors from the beginning again after almost 10 years and see what stuck out at me after learning and podcasting about this period for such a long time. And it's my goal to bring the stories behind the Tudors to life in a more accessible way for the average viewer. And hopefully, as time goes on, we'll get guests and people affiliated with the show to come on and talk about this more with us as well.
And I'm Jonathan, and I always hear my wife talking about kings and history and Tudors and stuff, and I really don't know much about anything. And instead of reading a history book, which I wouldn't really be into, I thought watching along to the Tudors television show would be a good introduction, and I could ask her questions on all the things that I have no idea what's going on with.
So this is kind of our date night. And also, we have a daughter, Hannah, and she's 3, and she's upstairs sleeping. Yeah, so I guess we can start with a recap of episode 1. So the first episode of the Tudors, which was broadcast in April of 2007, which seems like so long ago. And I should say, this assumes, every show here is going to assume that you've watched the episode or you are rewatching it with us or watching it with us. So there are spoilers, obviously, because we're going to talk about what happened. So if you don't want to know what happened, you should stop and go watch the episode and then come back to us afterwards.
And I think we might actually have spoilers for later if you don't know anything, because we're going to talk about sort of history. So, we might give away certain things, but if, hopefully you aren't too upset. We won't give away too much.
Anne Boleyn dies.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, see, that's an example.
All right, so the show opens with a completely fictional murder, which gets us excited for war with France. Grr, grr, war with France. And there's an awful lot of sex, and there's an awful lot of politics at court. And all of the major players are introduced in various ways. So we've got Henry and Catherine, who are Henry VIII, and Catherine of Aragon, his wife, and Mary Tudor, their daughter. And even Anne Boleyn makes an appearance at the end. And we've got Cardinal Wolsey and Thomas More. And I think the way we're going to go through this, rather than going through scene by scene, is Jonathan's going to ask questions about what happened in the episode. And then at the end, I'm going to wrap everything up with the main kind of themes that I saw coming out of the episode. Does that make sense?
Yeah, sounds good.
All right, here we go.
Okay, so the whole thing in Italy, that's not, his uncle didn't actually get killed by French guys and start a war.
No, he didn't have an uncle.
Okay, well, that makes that easy. So, and then the next thing they show is Whitehall Palace.
Yes.
What's Whitehall Palace? Is that where the king lived, or? Yeah,
Whitehall Palace. Henry VIII lived at a couple of different palaces. One interesting thing about this time period is that courts were always moving because it took so many resources to feed a court, the sheer number of people. And the court wasn't a place, the court was the king. So wherever the king was the court. And because it took so many resources to feed the court, they were always moving around. So he had palaces at Greenwich was one of his favorites. And there was, Hampton Court eventually. And he had palaces all over. And Whitehall was one of his newer palaces that was just being completed at this time. And it actually belonged to Wolsey to start with. And he took part of it when Wolsey fell. There was a lot of renovation that was done on it through his whole reign. And interestingly, some of the most famous portraits of Henry were at Whitehall Palace. And I could get into a whole story on the portraits, which I actually did in my podcast. But yes, Whitehall was a very famous palace that Henry kept court at. And also nowadays, Whitehall is where the English government, like they refer to Whitehall the way we refer to like Washington, D.C. They say like, oh, at Whitehall, that happened.
And so like the court was like the king and all kind of his like entourage, or as you might call him?
Yeah.
And like the government, or?
Yeah. Well, so the government was Parliament officially, but the king only needed to call a Parliament when he needed taxes. So in general, if he didn't need taxes, he didn't actually have to call a Parliament.
Okay.
So for day-to-day activity, he would rely on his counselors. And one of the things Wolsey makes rose to such fame early on in his career because Henry, in his early years, didn't really much care about day-to-day governing and handed it all over to his advisors like Wolsey.
Okay.
But yeah.
And who were those people? Like when they're walking into the palace or the castle, like there's all these people screaming with papers like, "Hey, Lord, Your Majesty!" Like who are those people?
They were people that wanted to tell the king something.
Okay. So
like,
it's like they had a letter, like my uncle needs $500 or something.
Yeah, or like, this village is having an issue with whatever, the plague. I mean, I guess that would be really important. But, something's I need help for this. Or, people who thought that they could either get a word with the king or with somebody high up, if you wanted to make some kind of a petition to the government.
So that's kind of like people these days, like writing an email to someone in the government, like, please hear my plea or something. Okay. And so Thomas Wolsey, is that his name? Who's that guy?
He was the cardinal at this point. And he's a main character in Henry's reign. He was actually the son of a butcher, and he rose through his intelligence and hard work. He studied at Oxford, and he was one of these kind of new men that Henry liked to surround himself with. And Henry really valued intellect over heritage, I suppose. And so he was a very efficient hard worker. He was very, very smart, and he rose through the church and became a cardinal. And was, a chief advisor to Henry. His fall ultimately was when he was unable to secure a divorce for Henry. Henry took his wrath out on...
He fell out of favor.
Yeah.
Okay. And did he live at Hampton Court, or?
Yeah, he had a number of palaces. One thing at this time, going into the church, a lot of times people think you go into the church to live a life of poverty and whatnot. That if you could rise, the church was a great career choice for people who maybe didn't have parents that could provide them with a head start, but who were very smart. If you went into the church, you could rise way, way high. If you were a hard worker and you were smart, it was much more kind of egalitarian, I guess. In some cases, if you came from a rich family, still you would go into the church and probably be a cardinal anyway. But you could rise much higher. It was more easy to go from class to class, I guess, in the church. And what did you ask me?
Oh, just if Thomas Wolsey lived at Hampton Court.
Oh, yeah. So he had a number of palaces, and Hampton Court was a palace that he built that was way modern. At the time, it was this amazing palace that had every kind of modern convenience. And he wound up actually, spoiler alert, having to hand it over to Henry as part of his downfall. He was trying to appease the king and gave him Hampton Court because Henry was always slightly jealous of it. But yeah.
Nice. That's not bad for the son of a butcher?
Uh-huh.
Yeah. And so there was one part where Henry was asking other lords or something and dukes about if he should go to war.
Yeah.
Who are those people?
Those are we talked about, the day-to-day kind of needs of government. Those would be the peers of the realm. So the peers of the realm were the people who were either minor nobles or major nobles, the younger sons of kings, for example, and their lineage. So as if you weren't the line that was going to be the king, you were the uncle.
Be second cousins to the king.
Exactly.
Or something.
And they were very old houses, the Dukes of York and the Dukes of Lancaster. And
that Buckingham guy, so his great-granddad was some king's best friend or something.
Not even the king's best friend, the king's brother, likely. And
something like that.
Or the king's sister. And then the peerage kind of goes down through the family. And the king could take those titles away. So sometimes, for example, some of those peers, when they fought, Henry VII, Henry VIII's father, when he took the throne, the nobles who fought for Richard III, his opponent, many of them lost their titles.
So he took away their titles.
And he could then give them to his friends.
Okay.
King could also create titles. So you could have the first Duke of blank and have that,
like what's her name? Catherine right now, who's in modern times? Is that her name?
Kate Middleton?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Isn't she like the
Duke and Duchess of Cambridge?
And that they just made that up, or?
I don't know.
Okay.
Maybe. But there were certain titles, that they would just make up and say, the Duke of Norfolk actually was one that was created right around this time. I think about 50 years before.
And so would they have like the Duke of Norfolk or the Duke of Buckingham or whatever? Those were places. Norfolk is a place and Buckingham is a place. And
his lands would be there.
Okay. And would they actually live there or go there, or did they have anything to do with it?
Yeah, so that's where they would get lands, they would get rents from that place. So if you were created the Duke of York, for example, you had your seat in York, you had most of Yorkshire. Chances are you're that wealthy. You probably also have lands in other places near. I think the Dukes of York had lands throughout close to Wales and things like that. But you were getting rents from all the farmers at that place.
So it's kind of like in the United States, like a senator or something. I mean, in a way, you'd be the senator of California, but you wouldn't necessarily live in California, but you'd have a house in California and you represent the people of California, and you'd probably have houses all over the place because you're rich. And, and, you'd be hanging out in Washington D.C. most of the time talking to the king.
Right.
I guess I'm sort of making weird analogy, but.
And also, really, really powerful ones, like they allude to here, could actually raise standing armies that were almost as big as the king. I want to ask you about that later. So
yeah. Okay, and then Henry, right, was playing tennis.
Yeah.
They played tennis back then? Or?
Yeah, they played what evolved into what's called real tennis. And interestingly, Henry V was the first king to bring tennis to England. Or to play it royally. I think it goes way back, but it was the first recorded instance of a king playing tennis. And Henry VIII did really enjoy playing tennis. And I like that scene because of the foreshadowing, because Henry built a really large tennis court at Hampton Court after he took it from Wolsey in 1530. I looked that up.
Nice.
And also, when Anne Boleyn was arrested, she was apparently watching a tennis match.
All right. So and then they get to his wife, Henry's wife, Catherine of Aragon.
Yes.
So she was Spanish?
Yes.
And Aragon is a place in Spain?
Yeah. There were two main kingdoms in Spain at the time, Aragon and Castile. Okay. And Ferdinand and Isabella they were each independent kingdoms that they married each other, and they united Spain into what we would now consider almost united Spain. And with that, they were able to drive the Moors out of Spain. But it's interesting, one kind of important thing to remember is that Isabella was a queen in her own right. She was an independent queen who married an independent king. And so Catherine of Aragon saw that growing up, that her mother was pretty much
that was her
equal.
Parents.
Yeah.
Ferdinand and Isabella.
Yeah.
And they were the people with Columbus, they sent Columbus off, and they kicked the Moors out of Spain.
Yeah.
And they did a lot of stuff. Okay, so their daughter was Catherine. And then he said something about your nephew, the King of Spain. So, why was her nephew the King of Spain and not her brother? Or
yeah, well, it goes into the whole, because it was two independent kingdoms, they kind of take liberty with saying the King of Spain. But what happened was, when Isabella died, the right to reign, or the right to become queen, actually would have gone to her daughter Juana, and who was Catherine of Aragon's sister. And Jonathan's touching me, too much detail. It would have gone to Juana, and Juana's husband made a big deal out of the fact that she was crazy and she couldn't reign on her own. And it's actually a very sad story. both Ferdinand, her father, and her husband were kind of fighting over her right to become queen of this land. And her husband had her declared insane and ruled in her name. And then it was their son that then inherited that. So it was Catherine's sister, Juana. It was her right. And then it was her son that then...
So they gave it to her son. So instead of her sister being the queen, it was her son. And her nephew. Well, yeah, I get it.
Yeah.
And then they had a daughter, Mary.
Yes.
And that's, like, true.
Yes.
Okay.
Mary Tudor.
And that's the only daughter, that's the only kid they had that lived? Like, they lost other kids, but...
It was so sad. And that's, like, a theme, but, yeah.
And so Mary grew up and stuff. Okay. And then there was the joust.
Dun, 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 dun.
So, like, that was, like, a thing. Like, people, like, they did that. Like, they rode on horses and knocked each other and stuff.
Yes.
And, okay, that's not just... I've seen it in all the, like, Robin Hood movies and stuff.
Right.
But, like, that was...
No, that was a thing. And it was actually kind of... it was almost like a training for war as well. And it was a chance to show your stuff. And it was,
So another way you could like make a name for yourself if you were just some guy from like the country in the middle of nowhere. Like you could be Jonathan the Great Jouster.
Yeah. And it would take you a while because you'd have to get sponsors and people to give you the money for
your way up. Yeah, the armor
and all that kind of stuff, which wasn't cheap. But yeah, there were actually cases of people who were very famous that did that. And also, it was something the nobles would do to show that they were ready for war and stuff. And in 1536, foreshadowing, Henry VIII had a horrible jousting accident. As he got older, he loved to participate in the joust. He was a huge sportsman and he loved to do the joust. And as he got older, people told him you shouldn't, especially because he didn't have a son. It's really dangerous. You shouldn't do it. And in 1536, he got very wounded with a wound that would last for the rest of his life. And a lot of people say that's the year that he kind of turned into the tyrant that we know him as now, and that it might have come from... There's a lot of theories around like blood poisoning and stuff from his wound, but yes, Henry participated in that.
So people wouldn't die, like when you knock someone off, it wasn't like half the people were dead at the end of the joust.
No,
okay.
But they could be unconscious and stuff,
It wasn't like a good thing.
And you could die. There was a chance, but...
But I was thinking like, okay, that guy's dead, okay, and there's like one guy living at the end. And he's the winner.
No.
Okay.
You'd kill off all your nobility.
Oh, that's what I was thinking. Okay, so then there was the guy on the side of the river. That was Thomas More.
Yes.
And he's a humanist.
Yes.
What's a humanist?
So this is the start of bringing Renaissance thinking to England. Thomas More was one of the early Renaissance thinkers. Humanism is, the new scholarship that had been growing in Italy that was treating studies, the classical studies, the rediscovering the classics of Rome and Greece. And like I say, I love, how you've heard me talk about how I love this period so much because it's when people started like singing just for the joy of singing and painting just for the joy of painting. And you didn't have to do it for like religious reasons. You could just do it because you loved it. And there was this whole scholarship of, educating the whole person and having, almost like we would say like mind, body, spirit, kind of everything linked together and being peaceful and studying lots of different things, studying science and all kinds of stuff. And Thomas More was one of the first ones. He wrote Utopia, which is a very famous work where he envisioned the perfect society. And he also brought Erasmus of Rotterdam, who was also another humanist thinker, to England back before Henry was even king. Erasmus came and toured through Cambridge and lots of other places. And so, yes, that was More.
Okay. And is that where, like, the word Erasmus comes from now? Like, when people go on Erasmus, like, they travel?
What?
Because that's what he did? Okay, well, I guess I know something that you don't.
Nice.
All right.
I have to look that up.
Well, you can come back to that. Okay, so while Henry was talking with Henry... Okay.
Sorry.
So then Henry was talking to Thomas More.
Yes.
he mentioned Henry V.
Yes.
And how he was famous for, Agincourt?
Uh-huh.
And, he said something about the archers and the other archers, and he was famous. So I guess my question, was Henry really kind of, fame hungry, power hungry? He really wanted to be famous like Henry V was, or?
Yeah.
Okay.
So Henry V was the last kind of great king before the Wars of the Roses.
And so were they related or not necessarily? That's a long story.
Through half.
Okay, so it wasn't his granddad or something?
No, it was his half granddad.
Okay.
Half step granddad. Anyway, Henry V was the last great king, warrior king, who came at the tail end of what we now call the 100 Years' War. He had huge success at the Battle of Agincourt. By the time his reign ended, he pretty much owned France and had been declared the heir to the French king. And then he died early. His son Henry VI did not have the same instincts.
Live up to Ted's potential.
He was much more pious and holy, and he wound up, the Wars of the Roses started under him because people didn't think he wound up losing all the land, and then the Wars of the Roses started, and then Henry VIII's father, Henry VII, took the throne by killing Richard III on the battlefield, and so then you've got Henry VIII then. That actually, interestingly, when Henry VIII came to power, it was the first transfer of power in over 50 years that had been bloodless. Mm-hmm. And so, Henry really saw this opportunity for himself to prove his success as a king, and also to harken back to say, I'm going to make England great again.
Solidify things again.
Yeah, and show we had this rough time, and now we're coming out of it, and I'm going to be this great Renaissance king, and I'm going to go get France back. And he really wanted to be seen like that. Okay.
And then there's another scene where Henry was hunting.
Yes.
They did that? They hunted on horses and stuff?
Yeah, they did.
And what did they hunt?
They hunt
sheep? I guess they wouldn't hunt sheep.
No, they hunted a popular thing. Well, there were all these laws around hunting, what you could and couldn't hunt based on your class and your status. But a popular thing for a king to hunt would be a boar. So there were still wild boars, and there was special forest land that only the king could hunt on. And to this day, there's the New Forest in England that was one of the early areas that were royal forests that were kind of separated off for the king. And so what you would do is you'd go out with dogs and you'd be on horseback. And in a lot of ways, it was like joust. It was seen as practice for war. Mm-hmm. So, because you needed a lot of the same skills, strength and being sometimes quiet when you needed to be quiet and having quick reflexes and everything like that. So, you'd go out with a pack of dogs, you'd find a wild boar, you'd chase the boar for hours and hours and hours until the boar got really, really, really tired. And then you'd throw some spears at him to keep away from the tusks, really, really long spears, because he had, of course, giant tusks. Yeah. And you'd throw spears at him, and then you'd come home with a boar.
Good times.
There's the Christmas Carol, the Boar's Head Carol. It was
Sure. Okay. If you say so. Okay, then there was another scene, it showed the guy Thomas Tallis, he was brought in, and there was a man with a bunch of little boys singing, is that what they... that's how they would sing in church back then or something? Or what? What's that about?
Yeah, so that is my great passion.
I know.
Anglican, 16th century Anglican polyphony.
Yeah.
That is my great passion. And people who want to learn more about it can listen to my podcast. Podcast plug.
Yeah.
No, so, English liturgical music was really special at this time, and it this flowering of Anglican choral music. But yes, that was high music. Now that wouldn't have been accessible to your average person unless they had a chapel near to them. Mm-hmm. But interestingly, Wolsey was a huge supporter of that kind of music, as was Henry VIII. Henry VIII had the Chapel Royal, which continued through for years, and there was actually these kind of wars. They would go back and forth poaching choristers from one to
What's
the
a
other.
chorister?
The young boy that you saw singing.
Okay.
So if there was there was actually one that was like a
good-
really, really good one, and he would be poached from.
And was that like they would like what was it? Make it eunuch? Like they would make them so their voices wouldn't change and they never grow up or something? Like, is that a thing or?
That was a thing in Italy.
Okay. That's like the Vienna voice power. That's something different.
That's different.
Okay. But it was all little boys singing like,
Yeah, they didn't use... Women wouldn't be allowed to sing in a church. Because,
why would you want a woman singing in a church?
And so they would have boys sing the female parts.
And then would men sing sometimes too?
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah, the men would sing, because the boys' voices hadn't... Yeah, the men would sing the bass and the tenor parts.
Okay.
The boys would just sing the alto parts.
So it wasn't all young boys singing?
No.
Okay.
And that's the kind of music that people would have listened to if you had access to... If you were a person who lived close to one of these chapels, and they, in Cambridge and Oxford and in Canterbury, there were these kinds of chapels that your average person could go and listen to the services sung in this way. But... and it was, interestingly also, nobles would have these kind of chapels that they would set up with these people singing to sing for their soul when they died as well. So there was a lot of this kind of singing going on.
All right.
Yes.
And then Thomas Tallis.
Yes.
They didn't really introduce him, but I've heard his name around our house a lot.
Yeah.
So can you give us a very short... not half an hour introduction of Thomas Tallis?
He was the granddaddy of English choral music, and he wrote music for, all 4 Tudor monarchs. And he was one of the rare people to have been successful under Henry VIII and Henry VIII's children all the way until the mid-1580s. And some of the most famous pieces of choral music that people who listen to this kind of music will be familiar with will know Thomas Tallis. He's a granddaddy.
I know it might be a strange question. Did he just get to die, or was he beheaded because he was he wrote a bad song?
No, I think he just got to die.
Okay, well, that's nice. Yeah. Okay, so about this treaty that
yes,
is this a thing? Is this a real? Was there really a treaty or what?
So they kind of rolled this in this episode. They rolled the Field of Cloth of Gold. There were 2 treaties. So they did want to have a perpetual peace treaty with all the nations. And that was originally called the Treaty of London. And it was, I think, 1518. It was this humanist idea. And that fell apart. You can imagine, it fell apart right away.
Well, it was kind of so how do we enforce this treaty? Oh, well, if someone gets aggressive, we all declare war on them until we have peace. It doesn't sound like the best kind of treaty.
Exactly, yeah. So there was the Treaty of London, and that was this brilliant idea that Wolsey had to have this perpetual peace, and it fell apart. And out of that, then, one of the things that came up was, during this time, and it lasts through the whole 16th century, England and France and Spain were always this triangle. France and England would be against Spain, or Spain and France would be against England. And it was always well, who can I get on my side to be against this person?
Sometimes one was...
Yeah. And so during this period, Wolsey was a supporter of the French, and he said, let's have peace with France. And so then they had the Field of Cloth of Gold, which was a treaty of friendship that they were signing. And that was... So there actually was this idea of this perpetual peace, which fell apart. And then out of that also then came this treaty of friendship with France. And that's what the Field of Cloth of Gold
So that kind of... Okay. And it's going to come up in later shows, but that kind of was sort of true.
Yeah. And the Field of Cloth of Gold was a magnificent event.
Okay, cool. Okay, later on, the guy, Thomas More.
Yes.
The humanist.
Yes.
It showed him, what was with that shirt? It showed him praying, and he had a torn-up shirt, and,
scars on his back.
Yeah, what was that about?
Self-flagellation was really not that unusual at this time. And a hair shirt is just that, a hair shirt. And you can imagine how, I heard it one time, an analogy that after you get a haircut, you know how itchy it is if they did.
Yeah, that doesn't sound like a good time.
Yeah, so it was a whole shirt that was made of hair. And it was basically to remind you that you were a poor sinner.
A horrible person.
Yes, and you would wear it underneath your clothes, and it was just kind of this regular penance. And I think sometimes people would wear it just during Lent or, just at some times. Thomas More was very religious. I don't know that much about whether he actually was into self-flagellation or how much of that was made up, but it wasn't that unusual to...
So there was a lot of guilt kind of going around with religious people then. Why are you laughing?
It doesn't ever change, does it?
I don't know. I guess not. I'm not too familiar.
I mean, they were all Catholic, right?
Okay. I wasn't raised Catholic, so I don't know.
Yeah.
All right.
I wasn't either.
I just hear stories.
Yeah.
So I had a question. Like, they're referring to people as different names. So they're like Your Majesty and Your Grace. Like, especially when those guys are going back and forth, you're welcome, Your Grace, and blah, blah, blah.
Yeah.
So Majesty and Grace and Eminence, like, those are specifically for people? Like, Your Majesty was just for the king?
Your Majesty was just for the king and the queen. And Your Grace was for nobles, for princes, the high up, the dukes who were royal. Like
the lord, like the Buckingham guy.
Yeah, and they could also be highnesses.
Okay.
And then also in the ecclesiastical realms, Your Grace could be like much higher up people.
What's ecclesiastical mean?
The church.
Okay. It's like religious stuff.
Religious people,
okay.
Yeah.
And then eminence was for, like a cardinal or something?
Yeah, the eminence was for a cardinal and high up.
And that's what that's what Wolsey is. He's a cardinal.
Yeah, he's a cardinal. So he was an eminence.
Funny red hat.
And his red clothes.
Okay. So a question, he was having a letter written. Like, he was telling his scribe when he was getting his beard cut.
Yeah.
And he was like, "Dear cousin, I love you," and blah, blah, blah. And
yeah.
So...
To Francis.
Who's the French king,
yes.
who he was going to go make a treaty with.
Yes.
But he really wanted to go to war with him, but then he got talked into having a treaty.
Right.
So, was that like the beard thing? Like, is that like, did he really start growing a beard, or like, what's that?
Yeah, so I wasn't sure about that either, and I had to look it up, and yeah, apparently they were supposed to meet in 1519, and Henry and Wolsey couldn't make that meeting, and Henry said he was sorry he couldn't make it, but he wasn't meant to think that... He didn't want Francis to think that he didn't want to come. He was kind of like, yeah, like, I really want to come. I can't make it at this time, but I really want to come. And to show you how much I really, really want to come, I'm not going to shave my beard. And apparently he wrote a letter, or there's a letter from August of 1519 that's between Sir Thomas Boleyn, who was on embassy in France, and Wolsey. And it says, "As proof of the king's desire, he has resolved to wear his beard till the said meeting. To requite this token of his affection, Francis laid his hand on his beard and said surely he would never put it off till he had seen him." But
so they both...
Yeah.
This is weird that the two kings like grew beards for each other.
It's like No Shave November, right?
That's okay. So that's like a thing.
Yeah, but Queen Catherine didn't like it, and apparently it was this whole, like, every time he showed up at court with a bigger beard, it would show that he was favoring the French over her Spanish, and it was this whole point of marital strife.
It was deeper than just a beard.
It was seriously
All right. Who knew? Like, I just thought it was just some silly thing they made up of the movie.
Yeah, and then Henry told him that his love for her was not in beards, but in his heart.
Oh, God. All right. And so, like, mail back then, like, he was writing on the letter. Like, how would that get there? Would they, like, send some guy on a horse?
Yeah.
And then he'd, like, take a boat?
Yeah.
And then ride it all the way? Like, would that guy... I mean, I guess you weren't there to see the mail, but would that one guy see the mail all the way there?
Yeah, or else there'd be trusted people,
so
like he handed it, like the Pony Express.
Okay.
Well, they're not a French person, but somebody that was Henry's person would go the whole way until it was delivered.
I get it.
And that was how royalty, of course, and people high up there was no like mail service, and so
yeah, that was my other question. Like, was there a way for like normal people, like peasants, to like deliver messages?
So they would use like traveling minstrels to deliver messages. So the minstrel would come in, people and storytellers and all these kind of people that would go from town to town to town. Yeah.
Okay.
And so the bard would come in and would sing his little song, and he'd say, I just came from Royston, and now I'm in Baldock, and so here's what's going on in Royston. Let me tell you the news from Royston. And then people would come up and say, oh, you know, my sister is in Royston. Have you heard anything about it? And, oh, well, I was just there, and she said this, and blah, 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 blah. And then he'd say, okay, next I'm going to go to Letchworth. And they'd say, oh, when you go to Letchworth, can you tell my brother, blah, 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 or, you know, whatever.
Or they give him, like, a letter to deliver or something?
Well, they didn't write, but they just
okay, so
say...
they tell him.
Yeah.
Like, I'm Chuck, can you tell...
Yeah. And the thing is also, though, most people at that time wouldn't have to deliver letters because your circle, you stayed in your village.
I get that.
Yeah. So you probably didn't have much of a need, but that's how news would get around and stories and stuff.
So a little later, he was in the confessional.
Yes.
And he was talking about, like, Catherine was married to his brother Arthur.
Yes.
Okay, so he had a brother Arthur.
Yeah. So Henry VIII was actually a second son. He was never meant to be king. And his older brother Arthur was named after the famous King Arthur of the Round Table. And he was meant to be ushering in this new age of the Tudors and, you know, showing their legitimacy and stuff like that. It was a big coup for their father to get recognition of their legitimacy by the fact that Ferdinand and Isabella were willing to give their daughter
to him.
Yeah. And so she came with a huge dowry, and Henry VII was famous for not wanting to ever spend money and give money up. So Catherine comes over to marry Arthur. They have a wedding and they go to Wales. And they're very young. They're just teenagers. And Arthur gets sick and he dies. And Catherine says it was never consummated. He was always too sick. We were never able to do anything. Blah 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 blah. I'm still a maid. And so Henry actually, for a while, even thought about marrying her himself after his wife died because he didn't want to send her back. Because he'd still, as long as he had her, he had like power over negotiating, and he had her dowry and stuff.
That's a lot of money.
So he actually kept her for 7 years or so, just in this weird position.
Waiting.
Like, are you going to... And they got a papal dispensation to marry Henry VIII because he said, all right, well, if you can't marry Arthur, marry Henry VIII. But then, like, it was one of these things that as foreign policy changed and Henry VII decided maybe he didn't like Ferdinand and Isabella so much anymore. Like, maybe he actually didn't want to have Henry marry her. Maybe he wanted Henry to marry somebody from France. And it was like all this going back and forth. And so then... But the thing is, Henry was like 10 years old when Catherine first came. And Catherine was 5-6 years older than him. And Catherine was this beautiful princess. And you can imagine, you know, the impression she would have made on this 10-year-old boy. And he was very precocious. And, you know, he came after his father died. He came to power and he said, I'm going to be this great prince. And he really saw himself like this prince who was riding in on a, knight of shining armor to rescue his princess, who he'd seen for so long in this period of like not knowing what was going to happen to her. And it was one of the first things he did was marry her. And they were crowned together, actually. So, yeah, Arthur was...
That's who Arthur was.
That's who Arthur was.
Okay. So then enters Thomas Boleyn.
Yes.
And I just, like, was everyone named Thomas back then? Because, so far we have Thomas Wolsey, we have Thomas More, Thomas Tallis, and now we have Thomas Boleyn.
And later there'll be Thomas Cranmer, and there'll be...
So that's everyone named their kid Thomas back then. Okay. Yeah. So Thomas Boleyn.
Thomas Cromwell.
Like, I recognize Boleyn, because, Anne Boleyn.
Yeah.
Like, he was, who's he? He's like a diplomat or something? Or?
Yeah, he was like a noble. He came from an older family. He wasn't one of the highest nobles in the land, but he came from an older family. And he was a diplomat, and he had a lot of interest in France, and his daughters were at the French court.
So he might have been a lord or something, but he was
like a viscount and
someone who
earl.
Went around and...
Yeah.
Okay, so he was in France and stuff.
Yeah.
All right. And he was talking with the Buckingham guy.
Mm-hmm.
The Buckingham guy was, talking to him about... how Henry surrounded himself with these lesser known people, and he was alluding to discrediting him discrediting his crown because he was like saying, "Oh, that doesn't lend much legitimacy," and Boleyn said, "Oh, we don't want any more civil war."
Yes.
Like there was a lot of civil. Was that the War of the Roses
the Wars
or
of the
something?
Roses. Yeah.
Okay.
When the nobility basically all killed themselves.
Oh, that was all like, "You're not the king, I'm going to kill you," and you're not the king, and I'm going to kill you and your brother and everyone. And so they're like, "We don't want that again, so you just shut up and we have a king." And okay.
The king is, and also Henry was the second Tudor by then, so we're now two. Henry VII, Henry VIII's father, saw a lot more rebellion under his reign of people who didn't think that the Tudors were legitimate. So but by the time we get to Henry VIII, it's like
we finally have peace. Just give it up.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
So, another question: Henry, did he really marry away his daughter Mary? Like, did he really give her up, a little girl, to like some guy in France?
He would have, but that didn't actually happen with France. It fell through.
Okay, but he was
stuff like that happened all the time. Okay. Yeah,
good times to be, like a princess. You were just like, "Oh, here's my daughter. Oh, wait, never mind. And here's my other daughter." And
your main value as a woman, if you were princess, your main value was you were used for negotiation, for marriage, to seal treaties. Like if for marriage, and then to bear children, to bear kings.
Yeah, sons.
And princes. Yeah, not even children, but men, boys. Interestingly, Henry VIII, his sister married into Scotland, and she, it's of her lineage that we have the Stuart kings, but she married into Scotland, and she was meant to go away. I think she was about 12, and her grandmother, Henry VIII's grandmother as well, actually tried to get it to work to have her not have to go until she was a little bit older, because that woman, Margaret Beaufort, had a very young childbirth. I think 12 was the age of consent at that point for girls, and you weren't meant to consummate a marriage before 12, and it was okay after that. And and a lot of times, like with Margaret Beaufort, her husband was in his late 20s, and she gave birth. It was a horrendous birth, and she gave birth to Henry Tudor, and she never had any children after him, even though she'd been married. She was married for another 30 years after him, so it destroyed her lady parts. And so then...
12?
Yeah, and so then when Henry VII was negotiating the treaty for his daughter, the princess, to go to Scotland, Margaret Beaufort came in and said, "Just so you know, don't send her until she's at least, a little bit older, because 14. Of what happened to me." Yeah.
Gosh. Okay, so speaking of children...
Well, you also have to remember people died sooner then, too. Yeah.
So speaking of having children and stuff, the blonde girl who Henry slept with and had a child.
Yes.
Like Blount?
Bessie Blount, yes.
She's a real person?
Yeah, there they made it all dramatic, like she was serving Catherine, and I suppose she was, but I don't know that Catherine wouldn't have talked to her at all. Catherine was so majestic and regal, she never would have.
But she existed.
Bessie Blount existed.
And she had a kid?
Mm-hmm. She had a son called Henry Fitzroy.
And he was a person. I mean, he was real.
He was real, and he was Henry's only recognized legitimate son, or illegitimate son. Sorry, he was Henry's only recognized illegitimate son.
But he wasn't like noble or anything because he...
Well, actually, for a while, Henry I think toyed with the idea of making him his heir, and he was a duke, and Henry gave him all kinds of titles and stuff like that.
He did become someone.
He died young. He was a teenager when he died. He married a high up lady, and then
was 12. Yeah.
Yeah. Right.
Okay, so there was the part where the Buckingham guy, he was like holding a pan of water, and Henry came out and like washed his hands in the pan. Like, what? Like, what's that about? Like, people held pans like for the king or something? I mean, I'm sure someone would have done that, but I guess what I'm confused on is like lords would have like held a pan, like. And
actually, the greatest honor that you could have, the groom of the stool.
No.
Yes, that was because think about it, you're so close to the king, you're like so close.
So like people wanted to grow up to.
Kind of, because like also Henry would talk to you informally. Like think of the dirt you'd get. Like not that was bad, but like
I get it.
Yeah, so it meant you had access to the.
So that king. Was actually all right,
and it was a huge honor.
So it's like an honor. Interesting.
Yeah.
And then the like kind of, I don't remember if it was the very last scene or the last scene. Like I didn't.
Mm-hmm.
There was the Buckingham guy, the Lord of Norfolk or whatever, and then Thomas Boleyn, and they were all talking about like how you would like kill a king with a knife or something. What was all that
father
about?
did to Richard III or whatever. Yeah. So Buckingham's father had actually led a rebellion against Richard III as well, and Buckingham in 1521 would be convicted of treason, and apparently people have said that it was one of the few treason executions that was actually deserved that Henry did. So he liked to rebel. And I don't know that meeting ever happened between those people.
But the Buckinghams were prone to trying to kill the king.
They like to stir things up.
All right.
Yeah.
Well, I really enjoyed watching the episode with me. Do you want to tell us about the main themes you saw as someone who knows the history of it all? Yeah.
So thank you for letting me talk. But there's a couple main kind of themes that I saw coming out of this episode. An obvious one was Henry needing a son. And this was something that would stay with Henry. And in a lot of ways, it was a legitimate concern for him. It wasn't as much for Catherine of Aragon, his wife, because she came from a line of strong women and her mother was a queen in her own right. So she didn't really see the problem with Mary becoming queen in her own right that Henry saw, because England had never had a female queen, except one time in like the 12th century, there was this woman called Matilda who tried to do it, and it turned into civil war. And since then, you needed to have a male. And after what they went through with the Wars of the Roses, he really needed to have a male heir. So that was something that was going to stick with him. And then we introduced the two Thomases, Thomas More and Thomas Cranmer. Not Cranmer, More and Wolsey. Thank you. And later on, there'll be two more famous Thomases, Cromwell and Cranmer. So we've introduced two of the four very important Thomases. And then another theme is that there was just so much sex. And that's so for Hollywood and for making it a hot film. But it's really important to note that Henry was really respectful as much as he could be, especially early at this point in his reign. In 15, 18, 19, 20, he wasn't questioning his marriage yet. He was very respectful towards, he wasn't just going around from woman to woman to woman. We know about Bessie Blount because she is so unusual. If there were dozens of them everywhere, we wouldn't know about them all. And so yeah, he wasn't like, yes, he was still having affairs and having a mistress, but which kings did, but it wasn't like everybody was just having sex with everybody all the time. And the whole the Field of Cloth of Gold is going to be really important for Henry's reign, but I think a lot of it is made of it because that's where Anne Boleyn first makes her appearance, and so looking back, it seems to be much more important than it might have been seen at the time.
And just a question, like, is that what that guy Buckingham was talking about at the end, where he says, buy a bunch of gold cloth?
Yeah.
Like, so that was for the meeting, or?
It seemed weird. I think he seemed like he was talking about it for rebellion, but they did use gold cloth. There was tents and everything was just cloth of gold.
So it's just like an illusion or something.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And just that Henry wanted power and to be a really great king. And this was something that Henry really wanted. I'm trying to look up this. Thomas More had this quote about Henry when he became king, and that he was going to be this amazing prince. And Henry really wanted to see himself as this person who was a humanist, who was a scholar, who was religious, and who was respectful, and who brought this Renaissance court to England and made England flower again. And that was really important to him. And I think we started to see shades of that. But also they started to make it look like Henry had this temper where he would lash out at Catherine. And at this point in their marriage, he was still hoping that he could have a son by her. And he was still, not questioning his marriage. Like, it showed him in the confessional saying maybe our marriage wasn't actually right and legitimate and whatever. But he didn't start to come up with that for another five years or so after this. So, I thought that was interesting that they brought that in early. But I think really important in this is that Henry needed a son, and Henry really wanted to be this really great king. And so that's what I saw. Awesome. So we'll be back next week.
Yeah, we'll see you next time for episode 2.
Exactly. I'm excited. Are you excited? Yeah. Bring it, right? Did you enjoy it?
I did. There was stuff for the guys in there. And
lots of boobs.
Yeah.
What did you think about it otherwise?
No, it was good. I can see why you hear about the Tudors and how they could make a movie about it or a show about it and have it be interesting, because it just seems like full of drama and intrigue and characters and stuff, and I guess we'll learn more. We'll learn more as we go on, or I will learn more. I guess you already know all of
I don't know it all, so it's good. All right, cool. So to learn more about us and to listen to archives of the show when we get enough to have archives, go to watchingthetudors.com, and we'll talk to you next week.
And also your Renaissance English History podcast is at inklandcast.com, so you can check that out if you're more into history than just the TV show.
Watchingthetudors.com is going to forward to a page on englandcast.com, so people will be able to easily find a link there too. So thank you for listening.
All right, take care, everyone.
That's why you've married me.
Yeah, bye-bye.
All right, bye.